matrix data.
I've got that lightning inside me, son of a god. I'm like a titan that's rising, oh, just you watch. I'm stepping into fate. There is no time to waste. I've got that lightning inside me. This is how legends are made. Are made. I'm cranking up on the throttle, victory is mine. Show you the harder the battle, harder I fight. I've come too far to quit. Stop back, I'm going in. I'm cranking up on the throttle. This is how legends are made.
Hello there and welcome to the first Armchair Admirals installment of this year. Welcome from our new streaming room, and with me here is Princeblip.
Hello everyone, I'm back from my my little hiatus to the United States, and
Yes.
we're here in, as Tuccy mentioned, in the new streaming room, but of course we're not alone.
Yes. Joining us are Drachinifel and Dr. Clarke. So, introductions for those of you of our viewers who don't know you, because for the first time we are streaming not only to the Warships PC Twitch channel but also to the Warships Legends channels.
Indeed. So Drachinifel is a noted history naval YouTuber, and Dr. Alexander Clarke is a naval historian and YouTuber covering naval history. So, but these guys have more to say about themselves and things to plug. So
Yes.
I'll let them introduce.
Well, Dr. Clarke has more things to plug, so he can go first.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you. The way to drop me in. I have a book out, which is a very cool book, which is Tribals, Battles, and Darings, and it's about the Royal Navy's development of the modern destroyer and the general purpose destroyer between roughly 1935 and 1950. And before anyone asks, the reason it's separated up that way is because due to COVID, I couldn't visit Canada and I couldn't visit Australia to do research into the RCN and the RAN then. And they, of course, got to use the Tribals, which I was using as the threading class to hold the whole thing together. More later, because the Royal Navy's Tribals after World War II, the Royal Navy went, we've only got 4 left. And as the Royal Navy often does when they have small classes, went, you know what, we'll get rid of those and we'll put our money into maintaining a larger class, which is efficiency savings, but personally I feel cruel, especially for HMS Nubian, considering in one war she very nearly reached the same number of battles or battle honors as HMS Warspite. So, you know, she done pretty darn well.
Yep.
And so I've got this, and this is a very, very cool book. I love it. And the pictures in there are, a lot of the pictures in there are courtesy to my very cool friend who's down in that corner, if I'm pointing the right way,
Yes.
Drachinifel, and his collection. He very kindly put it together, allow me to use the pictures, and it's a very fun book to produce, a very fun book to read, I hope, and I hope you enjoy it. And
Yes.
yeah, that's about enough from me. Please.
And Drachinifel.
Yes, as Princeblip said, naval historian, YouTuber, part-time drone pilot, as some people from the Royal Navy down in Portsmouth are all too eager to find out over the weekend. Thanks to its slight communication startup, I became the target of what I suspect is a low-level piece of electronic warfare, because my drone has never ever glitched out its control link between me and it, especially when it was 20 feet away from me right in plain view. But never mind. That all got cleared up, so hopefully there'll be some very good footage coming out of that anyway.
Did the drone survive?
Oh yeah, it just went into hover mode. I also found this, which allows me to sound like a ship's foghorn. which I'm very happy with, and Mrs. Drac is not.
And the neighbors, I presume, also are not appreciative.
Well, there's 3 or 4 walls between here and there, so but put it this way, they haven't battered the door down yet.
But at least now we have a perfect means how to announce your presence at any museum ship that you plan to visit.
Yes, this is true. They'll be coming from a long way off.
Oh.
So yeah, that's me.
And today's topic is specifically Battle of the Barents Sea, but in general, various things regarding Arctic convoys and surface raiders, especially heavy surface raiders, because this battle has a lot of common with this general topic. So, for a brief... Oh, let me quickly move through to the map. Where is the map? Okay, I know there is the map.
And it looks like the stream deck may have frozen.
Yes, it seems that... okay, so just while I try to make it work, just a quick introduction to the battle itself.
Yeah.
Mhm.
What was it about?
So, do you want to lead in, Dr. Clarke, or do you want me to?
Well, you lead in because I'm going to look at. I've got Sherbrooke's citation in this book for the battle,
Mhm.
so I thought I'd read it out, but I need to remember which page it's on.
Fair enough. So, Battle of the Barents Sea, it postdates PQ-17, which we've looked at before, and you've effectively got the situation on the Eastern Front is not going well, to be honest, for anybody at this point in very late 1942. The Allies are still running supply convoys to Russia, but they're now using the dead of winter when there's practically no light to do so, basically using the cover of winter darkness to avoid the worst attentions of the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe itself is getting more and more dragged into fighting on the Eastern Front anyway, so the large numbers of strike aircraft and recon aircraft that were around previously, there's something of a demand for them to be repurposed to go and attack the Russians directly. And the end result of all of this is that the Kriegsmarine is told that they have to take on a bit more of the load when it comes to trying to stop the Allied convoys. And so they develop a plan that involves 6 of their large destroyers plus the heavy cruisers Hipper and Lutzow. And the idea is to effectively pull off a very large convoy raid on what they think is a convoy that's defended only by destroyers and smaller ships, and to stop it completely and hopefully cause a similar kind of interruption that the destruction of PQ-17 did. So that's the scene setting for it, as it were.
Indeed, and we're in the very much the North Atlantic, or the Barents Sea even, which is above the Scandinavian countries. So very much filled with ice and not pleasant to fight in.
No,
Yes.
it's really not.
Yeah, this is just for illustration, the typical scene of this wouldn't be winter because there is a bit too much light, so I guess it's like spring/autumn, something like that.
Or maybe the very rare few hours of daylight. And to also give an idea of just how bad the ice conditions were at the time of the actual encounter that we're going to be talking about. Instead of the convoy sailing in several columns, which is how you normally see convoys sailing, they were all going in single file because there was, as far as they could tell, there was probably only one safe way through the ice, and they were all going to have to slalom their way through that. So the convoy was quite vulnerable to pretty much anything at that point.
Well, I mean,
In
anything
theory.
except the planes, right? Because
Well, I mean, even if, I mean, obviously the hours of darkness and the weather mean they're less likely to be attacked by aircraft. But in the event that maybe an aircraft made it out in those few hours of daylight, being strung out, they can't really offer each other much mutual anti-aircraft support,
Right.
Yeah.
which was one of the points of having everyone bunched up together in a convoy.
yeah, so I think one question springs to mind right here. basically 2 heavy cruisers were sent out. Why not Tirpitz?
Tirpitz wasn't available.
Yep.
Tirpitz just they didn't have the fuel and supplies to get her up and working as well. She was having was it one of the turbine? Forgetting which she was having engine difficulties, but I'm forgetting what type of engine difficulty it was. But she was getting needed parts and a refit and all sorts of things. She was just not in a good place at that time.
And well, the Scharnhorsts are not available either. So it's just the heaviest. These are the 2 heaviest ships they can get up and around.
I mean, Scharnhorst got there in March 43 only, so this was December 31, 1942. So
right, and the German ships we're looking at Admiral Hipper, we're looking at not Admiral Scheer, but Lutzow. We got Admiral
which is of course formerly Deutschland.
Right. And but renamed to Lutzow because you can't have a ship named for your country sink because that would be embarrassing.
Yes.
But trust me, if the Royal Navy had sunk her, they would have called it the Deutschland when they were sinking after they'd sunk her. They would have. It would have been everywhere around the world. They sunk the Deutschland. It would have been no mention of it being renamed Lutzow. It would have been we sunk Deutschland.
Yes.
Nah.
I mean, there was in the end, at the end of the war, there was a big argument going on between the RAF and the Royal Navy whether she was actually sunk by the RAF, right? The deck is still above water; she's not sunk.
Yeah.
But for this battle, she's involved.
Yes.
But I found it, and I've got the citation for Robert Sherbrooke, who was the commander. He's been commanded HMS Cossack during the Battle of Narvik. So that gives you a bit of an idea of his pedigree as an officer. And this is the Victoria Cross citation. The King has graciously pleased to approve the award of Victoria Cross for Valour in defence of convoy to Captain Robert St. Vincent Sherbrooke, DSO, Royal Navy. Captain Sherbrooke in HMS Onslow was the senior officer in command of the destroyer Escort, escorting an important convoy bound for northern Russia. On the morning of the 31st of December, off the North Cape, he made contact with a greatly superior enemy force, which was attempting to destroy the convoy. Captain Sherbrooke led his destroyers into attack and closed the enemy. 4 times the enemy tried to attack the convoy, but was forced each time to withdraw behind a smokescreen to avoid the threat of torpedoes. And each time Captain Sherbrooke pursued him and drove him outside gun range of the convoy and towards our covering forces. These engagements lasted about 2 hours, but after the first 40 minutes, HMS Onslow was hit, and Captain Sherbrooke was seriously wounded in the face and temporarily lost the use of one eye. At least one eye is how the medical staff wrote it. Nevertheless, he continued to direct the ships under his command until further hits on his own ship compelled him to disengage, but not until he was satisfied that the next senior officer had assumed control. It was only then that he agreed to leave the bridge for medical attention, and until the convoy was out of danger, he insisted on receiving all reports of the action. His courage, his fortitude, and his cool and prompt decisions inspired all around him. By his leadership and the example, the convoy was saved from damage and was brought safely to its destination. The force he was taking on wasn't just Lutzow and Admiral Hipper. The Germans also had 2 Type 36A, Z29 and Z30, 1 Type 36A of the modernized version, the Z31, and some Type 1934A, Friedrich Claude, and 2 other Type 1934s, Richard Bedson and Theodor Reidel, and they had all been sent out as part of this group. His group, Oslo, he literally had Onslow, Akates, Orwell, Obedient, and Obdurate. Akates, an A-class destroyer, he judged not capable because of other issues of leaving the convoy. So he drove off the German force with literally Onslow, Orwell, Obedient, and Obdurate. 4 destroyers.
And to put that in... Sorry.
They charged the enemy. Well, I'll just finish off. They charged the enemy 4 times. They fired a collective amount of torpedoes officially, which is greater than the number of torpedoes they were supposed to be carrying. So we can all be fairly certain, again, it was the Royal Navy magic torpedoes. We don't know where they came from. They're just in the launchers. We're going to use them. And the system. They fire at one point. They were down to, at least Obdurate was down to firing her baked bean cans, which is not something new. The Royal Navy destroyers have done this before. They found that the baked bean cans they had could fit inside the guns to be fired. They usually did it at the Italians because it was a double insult. The Italians receiving baked bean cans, which had tomato sauce in it. For starters, it was the tomato sauce is not proper tomato sauce argument. Then, in fact, it was baked beans. You know, that caused all sorts of troubles. But they literally were firing everything to keep these ships away and to buy time till the larger cruisers could get, the heavy escort could come up and go, "Do you want to play with us?" And the Germans decided, "We'd rather not. You know, we've just had too much fun dealing, too much of a party. We're partied out now. We'd like to go home quickly."
So yeah, and to give some context to that, so obviously not all destroyers are created equal. Achates is an early 1920s destroyer. It's literally the first generation of destroyer that the Royal Navy builds after the First World War. And to be honest, all the others are not tremendously a step up from that, because destroyers have gradually been growing in size through the interwar period, obviously peaking with the tribals and the JK, L, M, and N classes. But these are part of the O class, which are wartime emergency destroyers, which are basically almost reset the clock all the way, not quite, but almost all the way back to the A class. So they're 4-gun destroyers for the most part, and because they're designed as mostly convoy escorts, they don't have a tremendous number of torpedoes on them either compared to later classes. And conversely, the German destroyers that are present are obviously their big destroyers. They all outmass and outgun the British destroyers quite considerably. So although when you look at a very basic on-paper summary of the battle, it's 2 British cruisers, 2 German cruisers, 6 destroyers, and a handful of sort of trawlers and a mine layer for the British, that disguises the fact that the German destroyers are significantly larger combatants than the British destroyers. And of course, Admiral Hipper is an oversized 8-inch heavy cruiser. Lutzow is an 11-inch heavy cruiser, sometimes called a pocket battleship. And the 2 cruisers that the British have, 1, aren't there for the opening stage of the battle, and 2, it's Sheffield and Jamaica, which is a town class and a Crown Colony class. They're light cruisers armed with 6-inch guns.
Yep.
So the balance of power is quite heavily on paper in favour of the Germans, which is part of what makes this battle so remarkable. Although I have to say that you know, the Germans have, going into this, they have something going for them and they have something very big going against them simultaneously. What they have going for them is they've actually come up with a very good plan, and amusingly enough, the plan actually works, as we'll see later on. And the plan is to split their forces into 2, and Admiral Hipper and 3 destroyers will attack the convoy from the north. And the idea is then all the escorts will be forced to go off after them, which will leave the convoy open to Lutzow and the other 3 destroyers coming up from the south to lay waste to the convoy, which is the main objective. And you might think, well, hang on, Lutzow's got the bigger guns. Why is it not fighting the escorts? And the thing is, again, they're thinking the escorts are destroyers. Hipper is faster than Lutzow, and it's got more heavy guns, and they can fire faster. So Hipper is actually a better choice to deal with destroyers than Lutzow is. Obviously, if they'd known that the 2 British cruisers were in the offing, they probably would have switched that around, but they didn't. So that's what they had in their favour. They had this actually quite well thought out plan, and they were executing it. The thing they had going against them were their orders. And much as, you know, sometimes it can be tempting to blame Hitler for everything, we know that's not entirely true or fair. In this case, he does carry a fair bit of the blame because his orders are completely paradoxical. He wants them to be aggressive and to take out convoys and to attack the British. He also wants them to specifically to not risk their ships and to avoid engagement with superior forces, and to, above all else, take care of the big ships, Hipper and Lutzow. So the Germans are being told simultaneously to attack everything in sight, but also not take any risks, which is kind of, you know, those 2 things don't actually mesh together very well, and that influences a lot of what actually happens at Barents Sea.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a good situation to be in when you're facing British destroyer officers, especially not the ones who've come through the tribal school, because they've basically had aggression and aggressive action baked into them.
And
That
more,
is
yeah.
a job to
and
protect
more specific,
and
yeah.
attack.
More specifically with Sherbrooke, there's a reason he has St. Vincent in the middle part of his name. He is a direct descendant of Earl St. Vincent, aka John Jervis, aka Nelson's mentor. So, asking someone with that pedigree what he's going to do in the face of the enemy, there is only one response, which is to charge, which is what he does.
Yes,
looking at
it's
the-
one of
I'll
those
just
things.
quickly jump in. Looking at the chat, it seems that they were very much amazed by the idea of shooting bean cans at the enemy,
Yep.
and the chat is now discussing basically nothing else.
Bean can
Well,
animation.
this is
They
this is
are
all
also
part of-
asking whether those are bean cans behind you.
No, these are cans. These are cans that explain some of my mysterious capabilities, so the people who are watching in 1080p can work out what they say. But no, I mean, it's, to be honest, it's not atypical for Sherbrooke's tactics during this entire time, because he knows when he sees Hipper come over the horizon, he is entirely conscious of the fact that his ships can't win a stand-up gunfight with Hipper, let alone the other German destroyers, and so he, according to both sets of records, including the Germans, the British destroyers appear to make several torpedo attacks, many torpedo attacks. A bunch of them are fake because, of course, a destroyer, when it's facing a heavy cruiser, will try and charge it down, then turn broadside, which is when you unleash your torpedoes, then turn away. And in the sea, the heavy seas, the snow and the ice and everything, you can't tell if they've actually launched, but they've done all the behaviors associated with a launch. And what Sherbrooke does is he repeatedly does this because he knows if he actually fires his torpedoes, the threat is gone.
Yeah.
And if he's got any carefully squirreled away reloads, it's going to take quite a while to get those into action. And so by doing dummy runs, because the Germans have these orders, you can't take any risks. If they think there's a possibility of a dozen torpedoes in the water, then if they're going to follow their orders, then Kumentz, the German admiral, has to break away with Hipper. And you constantly get this pattern of Hipper coming in and being forced back, and coming in and being forced back by dummy torpedo runs.
What they'd sort of do is they'd fire, maybe one of the destroyers in the group would fire its torpedoes, and then the others would not fire theirs. So there would be some torpedoes in water, but instead of there being a run from all the destroyers launching their torpedoes, only one would launch. And they could also fake launch. This is something the Royal Navy were quite good at doing again with torpedoes. They could make them look like they were letting off steam, or all sorts of things they do. And it goes back to, why were they putting the baked bean cans in there? Well, because as long as they were firing their guns and looking aggressive, they looked like they were still armed. So you'd fire the baked bean cans, because if you're out of range and you're not got a chance of hitting your shells anyway, you're firing something, so something's coming out. And to be honest, the lighter baked bean can versus the shell actually might hit the other ship, and it won't cause any damage. But the 4.7-inch shell won't cause any damage to the hipper either. But it's something of ringing off the armor, and that's the point. It's a very British destroyer approach. Is we will plaster our enemy in fire, and something will do damage, or at least keep them busy and so off on one foot and off center. They won't want to push. They won't want to press.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Now
when you launch, you have this group of destroyers attacking and launching one set of torpedoes at a time. Anytime a torpedo is launched, Hipper's sonar is going to pick that up. And so,
they're going to hear things are coming. The propellers,
And
and I mean,
when all is said and done, it's enough that you hear one torpedo, because that means that there are some torpedoes, and you still have to start dodging, right?
Yeah.
It's
yeah. And the thing is that, the early stages of the battle, although Sherbrooke's putting up an absolutely valiant defense, and as his Victoria Cross citation points out, he loses an eye eventually when his ship is hit. But he maintains a stiff upper lip to the point that one of the other people on the bridge, who's picking himself up after the shell blast, looks around, sees a ton of blood all over him, and concludes that he must have been wounded, because the only other person nearby is Sherbrooke, and Sherbrooke's still standing there giving out orders as if nothing's happened. And it's only when he looks around and realizes that basically half the guy's face is missing that he's like, oh, actually, this isn't my blood.
Yeah.
I'm okay. And then he passes over command. But despite the valiant action of the destroyers, two things happen. One is a mine layer, HMS Bramble, which is further off north from the convoy, trying to find a merchant ship that got lost earlier. There we go. Yeah, little Halcyon class mine layer. She ends up wandering in, or being encountered by Hipper, whilst Hipper's on one of her withdrawals. And, you know, in true small ship fashion, decides that the best thing to do in this tiny little minesweeper is to engage Hipper in a gunfight, because why not?
Well, she does have 2 4-inch guns.
Yeah.
Rather could cause damage.
Rather.
Are you trying to tell this minesweeper, this Royal Navy fleet, that it should back down? That just because it's small? Would you tell that to my corgi? That just it's small, it doesn't think with them. Seriously, Mike. You know,
unfortunately, it doesn't.
It's a Great Dane scenario.
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't work out too well for Bramble. She is sunk with all hands by Hipper, and then when Hipper comes back round again, first Achates, which is with the convoy, has been laying smoke, basically all possible smoke to hide the convoy. Smoke floats, smoke from the funnels. The only slight downside of this is she's put up so much smoke. Literally, the only thing where the convoy was is Achates. So Hipper manages to hit Achates hard enough that eventually she sinks as well. Then Hipper starts laying into the destroyers, which is when Sherbrooke gets wounded. So at this stage, it actually looks like, despite some initial hesitation, the German plan is actually coming up trumps, because they've sunk out Minesweeper. Achates is in the process of sinking. They've damaged 2 of the O-class that are in Sherbrooke's flotilla. They haven't taken much of anything in return, and the tactic has actually worked. All the British escorts for the convoy are north. The convoy is open to Lutzow to attack. It's at this stage that you almost get a kind of a Lord of the Rings Two Towers event, because then Sheffield and Jamaica come steaming over from on the other side of the battlefield, and start laying into Hipper from her blind side, because she's not looking that way. Hipper at first thinks, with the number of shells coming in, that it must be destroyers from somewhere or other attacking her, but in fact it's, you know, a town class and a Crown Colony class pumping out 6-inch shells. They do score damage, and Hipper's trying to decide what to do, because again, in theory at this point, her 3 big German destroyers should be capable of taking care of what's left of Sherbrooke's flotilla, and in theory Hipper should be capable of at least giving a decent fight to the 2 British cruisers, even if it is 2v1. But once again, the orders to be careful with his ships come back to bite him, because Hipper takes a few hits, including one that leads to some leaks in the boiler room. And although it's relatively minor damage in the grand scale of things, because of these orders to be cautious, Hipper is then falls back again.
I think
which
also,
leads.
I think it also didn't help that the British cruisers managed to score the hits actually very early in the engagement, so it was quite unexpected given the circumstances.
Yeah, because this is kind of. This is late 42. This is the beginnings of the eras of World War II, when radar-directed gunfire is really coming into its own, and a lot of the British ships have this capability, which is helping a lot, because obviously it's dark, there's snow, there's ice. Yeah. It's not a good time for optical fire control systems, and it's one of the reasons the Sherbrooke's flotilla is even still alive at this point, because the Hipper is finding it very difficult to track them through the various snow schools they're hiding in. So the German attack north kind of breaks down at this point. You then get a slightly tragic - comic event, because the 2 of the German destroyers that were with Hipper, they don't know the British cruisers are here. They haven't actually noticed because of the weather. This is how bad it is. They haven't actually noticed the gunfight Hipper's been involved in. Hipper's just vanished, just done a 180. And they see Sheffield, and for some reason, I guess it's understandable, they see a big cruiser. They think Hipper's the only big cruiser there. They conclude that therefore must be Hipper. They form up on Sheffield, and it turns out Sheffield is in fact Sheffield, and erases one of the German destroyers, and within about 90 seconds. Sorry, something's messaging. Don't know why. Yeah, it basically erases one of the destroyers in about literally 90 seconds. The other destroyer takes one look at the situation and goes, "Screw this for a laugh, I'm out," and ducks back into a squall. And that kind of breaks down. That's the end of most of the engagement up north. At which point the action shifts south to Lutzow and her destroyers, which have the convoy dead to rights. It's sort of 3 to 6 miles to most of the ships, which in naval terms is point blank range in World War II. Mm-hmm. And then for some unearthly reason, probably due to just having swung on her anchors for so long in Norway, she opens up with dozens and dozens of 11-inch shells and even more 5.9-inch shells and fails to hit anything. It's literally one of the worst shooting performances of the German Navy in either war. It's point blank range, defenseless ships, they can't fight back, and nothing is accomplished long enough for Sheffield and Jamaica to switch from being on the north side of the convoy to head down and start engaging Lutzow, at which point the same orders that have seen Hipper withdraw kick in for Lutzow. You know, we're now facing 2 enemy cruisers. This is a risk to Lutzow. Right, we need to fall back. Lutzow falls back. Obviously, her escorts fall back. And although the material losses are roughly equal, the one big German destroyer versus one small British destroyer and minesweeper, you do have Hipper slightly damaged, but that's somewhat immaterial to the fact that the German objective was to take out the convoy. They haven't even damaged the convoy, and the British objective was to protect the convoy, which they've successfully managed to do, despite the fact that at any given point their forces were outnumbered and outgunned. And to be perfectly honest, if it's not as though apart from maybe Lutzow's gunners, it's not as though the rest of the Kriegsmarine crews there didn't know what they were doing. You know, Hipper hit multiple targets. She did. Hipper got rid of Achates, got rid of Bramble, damaged 2 of the O class. You know, Hipper's gunners were on their game as much as they could be. It was more a set of, you know, they had compromised orders from the beginning that were a ball and chain around their ankle.
Yeah, there is a question from Fog Battleship Scharnhorst in the chat. Is that because the gun crews were bad or because optical shooting conditions were that bad? But I think you've answered it already. I mean, the optical conditions were bad, but Hipper managed to hit targets. The destroyers that were with Hipper managed to hit targets. I just wanted to ask...
The Lutzow group just hadn't had the training. They hadn't had the...
Yeah, Hipper's crew, they were hitting small maneuvering dazzle camouflage targets that were ducking in and out of snowstorms at roughly what you'd call medium range. Lutzow's gun crew basically had practice shoots at defenseless merchant ships that were much larger, not maneuvering or particularly fast at short range. And the weather conditions weren't that different, you know, the 10, 15 miles apart that those 2 engagements were being fought.
I wanted to ask, were there any communications during the action between the Hipper group and the Lutzow group, or were they just going by the original plan and not talking to each other?
It was during the actual engagement itself, there was radio silence because they had the 2 groups, and if they had been chatting with each other, obviously at either side of the convoy, then by necessity those communications have to cross the convoy, which would give away to the convoy the fact that there are 2 groups out there. So once they were in position, they were communicating beforehand to set up the maneuvers that had led them to form this pincer. But once the engagement actually started, it's a mixture of the 2 groups aren't supposed to be talking to each other, and even if there are messages being sent out, by the time the shooting starts, no one's really paying all that much attention anyway. As we see with the loss of the German destroyer, you know, if Hipper had communicated, "I'm leaving," then they would have known that, you know, I'm leaving because there are 2 British cruisers out there. They might have double checked who they were forming up with. And even if Hipper might have tried to do that, certainly nobody on the destroyer got the message.
I think you also have to realise there is a lot of luck on the British part going on. There is the Vincent luck, which of course Sherbrooke is benefiting from, and Olsen Vincent was nothing if not a lucky commander, and it goes through Sherbrooke as in his experience in Cossack and various other things had been incredibly lucky. There's also Shiny Chef, which is which is also quite lucky, and
Shiny Chef.
It's a nickname for Sheffield, HMS
Oh.
Sheffield.
Yeah.
And there is the fact that this is going to sound strange. We like as humans, we like to have reasons for things, and we like to have science down, and we look at the stats and we look at the engineering. But there are some ships and some people who, in warfare, seem to go through with plot armor, and we can't really explain it other than luck. And it's not. Maybe it's an X factor. Maybe it's an instinct. You know, if Sherbrooke had been an inch to the left or an inch to the right, he could have lost his entire head rather than side of his face, and because of the damage, and would have been dead and wouldn't have been able to carry on the command. But he didn't. He survives. He comes back after he goes down and gets repaired. He's back on the bridge within about 30 minutes, and then he's sent down again, and he's back again, and he's down again, and he's back again, because he's keep going up to try and keep appraisal of the events and make sure he's there to support his crew, and to give them confidence and reassurance that he is there, that he is there to lead them, even if he isn't giving out the direct orders, and he's got sort of, he is reassuring his crew. And with HMS Sheffield, you could sit there and look at the Royal Navy and go, well, you've got 2 light cruisers. They have got, between them, 21 6-inch guns. Taking on 2 heavy cruisers, there's been a 3-to-1 of light cruisers. Well, 2 light cruisers and a heavy cruiser versus one of versus Lutzow's sister, the Graf Spee. This is now 2 heavy cruisers versus. That shouldn't have been an occasion, even with the advantages they have in terms of firing practice, in terms of radar. And Sheffield have been one of the first ships to get radar and radar-controlled gunnery. There shouldn't have been that. That's not a scenario where they should have gone in and felt really confident. They should have been going in and almost being tentative. But instead, they go in and they're confident from the beginning, because there's that sort of feeling in them that we're HMS Sheffield. We've gone through this battle, that battle, and we've come through fine. We're going to come through this one fine, so let's just go in. And that, you can see that in the pace of firing, because if you consider these 6-inch guns, etc., they are very dependent upon the speed of their manual loaders, speed of their crews.
Here's an illustration example.
Yeah. Yes, and if the crews are lacking if the crews are scared, if the crews are lacking in morale for some reason, that's going to slow down the pace of firing. There's going to be mistakes, they're going to be distracted. They're confident, they are firing fast, and Sheffield at one point is recording a rate of fire which is the peak of what you can achieve with those guns. She's literally keeping up, and she keeps that up. And the same with her Crown Colony cousin. They're keeping up this rate of fire. And you can argue maybe it's desperation or these things, but it's that if it's out of desperation, then mistakes tend to. Well, think about it from your own experience. If you're driving and you're scared and worried about something, you tend to make more mistakes than if you're driving conditions and you're confident. Even if they're bad conditions, you're less likely to make a mistake because you're more likely to trust your judgment and keep going. And this is the point with the gun crews. The Royal Navy's gun crews and the destroyers, they are confident. They are used to what they're doing. They know what they're doing, and they're going to keep it up. Akate's, she knows she's revealing her position. You know, she's laying all this smoke and all this thing. She's charged around. She knows she's visible to the enemy. She knows she's got a target on her back. And they're not hesitating. They're doing it. And it's not just a small part of the crew which have to be doing it. The whole crew has to be behind it if they're going to act the way they're going to do. They all have to be motivated to do it. And we talk about the Halcyon class Bramble and what she does. Again, you can't do that sort of thing of turning your small little ship onto a heavy cruiser if your whole crew isn't behind you. And remember, one of her cousins, another Royal Navy sloop, had during the Tsingtao incident when sister of HMS Sheffield, HMS Birmingham, went to rescue a British merchant vessel from the Japanese in Tsingtao in 1939, in modern day Qingdao. The Japanese heavy cruisers, possibly four, turned their guns onto HMS Sheffield. HMS Birmingham. And HMS Birmingham turns her guns onto them. But so does the little sloop. Swivels her 4-inch gun. These are Japanese heavy cruisers, the Ashigara class. She has no chance of doing anything with her 4-inch gun to the Ashigara and her sisters. None at all. And yet, she does it. Because it's what they expect of themselves to do. And this is the big factor the Royal Navy always sort of has in its back pocket. The Royal Navy crews expect themselves to fight. They expect themselves to win. They expect themselves to triumph. They they believe that they are going to. And this means they always go in with that confidence, which allows them to perform at the best they can be asked to do.
And you can see how this affects different battles. Whether or not, depending on the confidence and orders that that the various ships have, because as I said, it could have gone very differently. And with the exception of Lutzow's gunnery crews, I don't think there's. Although Hitler, the aftermath of this is Hitler flies into an absolute rage. He ends up sacking Admiral Raeder. He ends up demanding that everything bigger than a destroyer in the German fleet is scrapped, and everything's concentrated on U-boat production. Although that doesn't quite pan out because he's so angry with this result. As I said near the beginning, a lot of it is actually down to Hitler's orders. It's not necessarily the fault of the Kriegsmarine crew, because when you look at various engagements in the Second World War, when the Kriegsmarine is actually allowed to do what it's supposed to, when the aggressive officers who have a similar mentality to a lot of the British officers get let off the leash, battles are a lot more closely fought. So, Hipper herself, earlier in the Norwegian campaign, obviously sank HMS Glowworm, even though, technically, according to orders, she should have retreated in the face of a single destroyer, because she was, at that point, a troop carrier, not supposed to be hunting for a fight. But her captain was aggressive enough to see a threat and decide, I'm going to fight it rather than run away. And similarly, in that campaign, you have Admiral Marschall with the two Scharnhorsts. Again, his orders are in some ways similar to what the orders to Hipper and Lutzow are in this battle. Don't engage a superior or equal enemy force, basically be very cautious. But he thinks those orders are stupid and he's not going to follow them. And his drive is why the Scharnhorsts end up both finding and then sinking HMS Glorious.
Yeah.
So it's not as...
To be fair, he doesn't push when Renown turns up.
No, this is true. But then, there's a difference between being aggressive and being stupid. There's a reason Achates doesn't come in to attack as well, but does a smokescreen for the convoy. There's a balance to be struck.
To demonstrate this point, I've put in here the image of Achates from actually close to the end of her career before the convoy, and basically not only she was A class, not really the top of the line fleet destroyer anymore, but she was also converted into anti-submarine role quite heavily. So she lost, I think she lost 2 of her main guns. One was replaced by Hedgehog. One was taken off just to free up some top weight. I believe also she lost 1 set of torpedo tubes, keeping just 1.
Yes.
So basically, it was not only that she was older destroyer, but she had a very limited armament to help against the heavy ships. So relegating her to...
And she also had to be retrofitted with Aztec, because her class had come into service before the Royal Navy had working Aztec for destroyers.
Yeah.
So still developing Aztec when she was being built. So Achates, the A class and the B class are to an extent templates for what the Royal Navy destroyers can become, and it's really from the seas onwards that you get into the pattern of what the Royal Navy destroyers are going to be built to, and then you have the tribals, and then they have some more destroyers, and then they try and go down, and then they go back up again because they realize we actually do need the big destroyer.
Yeah.
But it's like
We aren't going to get the oodles of cruisers we thought we managed to if we got out the treaty system.
Yeah.
But so, continuing with the point I was making is the fact that, you know, a lot of the reason this battle goes the way it does is because of, you know, effectively the battle is won and lost before the first shots are fired, because of the attitudes of the various crews. Obviously you can never know, you have to roll the dice, but if the Kriegsmarine force had just been given the orders, go in, destroy the convoy, destroy the escorts, fight your way through and kill everything, I suspect the battle would have gone a lot worse for the British, even though it would have been the same ships and etc. And they're held back by this insistence from high command that they cannot risk their big ships, when by their actions you can quite clearly see that the captains and other German officers involved are willing to do so. And as I said with the other examples, when they're allowed to do so, or when you have officers who just, you know, decide stuff the orders, we're going in anyway, you get much closer fights. And this is actually where you get some of the most vicious fights of any World War, whether it be World War I or World War II, is when you get clashes between two sets of ships where both sides' officers are determined to fight and attack and not back down.
Yep.
But in this case, you have the contrast of one set of officers who have been ordered to back down and another set of officers who will not back down no matter what. And unsurprisingly, that means that even though they've got the on-paper advantage, in this case it's the Kriegsmarine who blinks first.
Right, because one point of comparison here is the smallest destroyer that Germans are bringing with them, which is going to be Z4, which is Friedrich Eckelt, if I remember right. But it's 33% larger than the biggest destroyer the Royal Navy's bringing. So it's like 2,100 tons versus 1,600 tons, and so and that's the smallest destroyer where Germany's bringing with them, and it's somewhat ironic that in one of the 1939 documents for the German basically fighting manuals is that they say history of all wars proves that apart from certain material basics, the precondition for great success basically lies in the firm belief in one's own strength. It's the idea that morale is going to help you win the battle, and if you have any sort of ability to think that I can get away, then or I need to get away, then it kind of undermines your whole fighting attitude.
Yeah, and you see this same attitude crop up again, because for those of you out there who have been long-term listeners of the Armchair Admirals series, you'll know when we've spoken about the Battle of the North Cape previously, you might recognize a lot of these names, because half of the O-class destroyers that are present at this fight, as well as Sheffield and Jamaica, are present almost exactly a year later at the Battle of North Cape, and you see exactly the same attitude again when it comes to charging down Scharnhorst.
A cynical thought, maybe the HMS Sheffield crew liked spending so much time up in the Arctic because there was less chance of friendly aircraft fire.
Yes, this is true. There are fewer swordfish present in the Arctic skies.
We have a question from 31 Not Burke. Did the Germans have any form of electronic range finding? Well, I believe the ZACT was a range finding radar first and foremost, right? But
yes, yeah, they had some. The Germans did have radar of various sorts equipped on some of their ships, but at this stage in the war, generally the West, at least the Western Allies, the British and the Americans, as a rule of thumb, generally were slightly ahead when it came to naval radar. But it was very much a kind of, catch up, one gets ahead, maybe a slight advantage, then someone else takes a big leap. But at the end of 1942, which is when this battle's being fought, radar is more prolific, and you have more what I would loosely term second and third generation radar sets deployed on the British fleet, as opposed to the Germans, who are kind of a mixture of first and second gen radars, and they're not quite as prolific. And the other thing is German radars, although it's not quite as bad as it was in early 41 with Bismarck, they do still have a habit of breaking at the most inopportune moments, whether it be because of ice build-up, shock of your own guns, the moon's not aligned properly, or whatever. Once the Germans get their own, again, what I loosely term third-generation radars, more widely deployed through the fleet in sort of mid-43 and onwards, it becomes much less of a problem, especially because they identify some of the components that keep failing and replace them with better versions. But in late 42, whilst, yes, they have radar in this kind of scenario, it's not really... You basically can't really guarantee it's going to function all that well.
We have here a technical comment that Princeblip is too quiet, so maybe move
too
the
quiet?
microphone a bit closer. Yeah,
There you go.
sorry for that.
More microphone.
And it does have the other thing sort of that happens, and this is going to sound strange to some people, but when you've got large pieces of ice flowing around, they can actually reflect radar, especially early radar. They can cause issues. And if you're dealing with smaller targets like destroyers, and there's large bits of ice around, it can get quite problematic to try and figure out which is, from the returns you're getting, which is a destroyer, which is a piece of ice.
Yes.
And
And not only ice, but also large waves, right? Because it's winter in Arctic Ocean, so it's not calm seas.
I imagine that pieces of tin flying around isn't helping. I imagine that flying around, or tin cans flying through the air isn't helping either.
No. I mean, the other thing you've got to remember is that it also comes down to how experienced your radar operators are, because it's not, when we say radar, in late 1942, the radar isn't what we think about now, you know, a green cathode ray tube with a little beam running around and little distinct dots appearing. It more closely resembles an oscilloscope gone mad. You just have a line and various peaks of signal strength, and that is pretty much all the information you have. And then you have to determine from that, you can tell from roughly how far along that line the peak is, what the range of your contact is, but what that contact is and what bearing that contact is on is something you have to figure out separately. So it's much more difficult to work out what you're actually looking at. And a lot of the British ships, as is hinted by the fact they show up a year later at North Cape, these ships have been on the Arctic routes for quite a while, so their crews have a very good idea of what's an iceberg, what's a friendly, what's not a friendly, etc. when it comes to operating in battle. And the Germans, even if they've practiced, there's nothing that beats practical experience, and they've spent a lot of time swinging at anchor in Norway. The kind of indicators that we recognize, the green cathode ray tube, also called plan position indicators, they don't start entering service period with any radar until the following year, and they don't see deployment in naval radars until a little bit after that.
I just have to quickly jump in here to correct this a bit, because the PPI scopes were already coming into service on ships in, not sure if in the Royal Navy as well, but at least in the US Navy in mid 42.
They were being experimented with, yes.
But they were on several ships already in the Guadalcanal campaign, and they might have been a reason for survival of these ships in the night battles. But the thing is, sorry.
The Royal Navy called them. There's a debate as to whether it's plan or plot position indicator. There are some documents which refer to it as one, and some which refer to it as other. So you can find books which say that. The reason I say that is because if one of my Canadian colleagues is watching this, he's probably screaming at me because he swears it's always plot, and I actually agree with Drac. It's more likely plan, but that will get forth an argument. The point is, the Royal Navy had they were getting into service, but they were limited, and they were being developed, and the Royal Navy was deploying them first in the slightly more scary area, i.e. the Mediterranean. So the ships that the Royal Navy had, which were getting them first, were mostly the ones in the Mediterranean, and they were getting through. So at this point, the Royal Navy doesn't have them. They do have them on these ships by 1943, but the ones the Royal Navy does have are in the Mediterranean. And the Americans, again, the Americans don't have all that many, but again, they make sure the ones they do have are in the area which they consider the most dangerous one. And it's interesting thing is always is that some of the ships which get them first are Force K, operating out of Malta, which is the surface force from Malta, which his job is to go around basically the Mediterranean and try and disrupt Italian convoys going to North Africa and Italian operations in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, when it comes to PPI, what I'm referring to is broad production of them. Yeah. So there's kind of odd experimental units. So kind of we're deploying this one to see how it works, and maybe there'll be another one somewhere in that operational theatre, but that'll be kind of the one that was sent out a month later, which has been improved upon, and then there'll be a small batch of 3 or 4 here or there, but it's not everywhere, and it's definitely not here. The kind of the mass deployment where you could reliably think this is what everyone should have been able to see. It doesn't apply to Barents Sea.
And I did recently read a very interesting book. Which name right now escaped me? Learning War. About the American development, and only there it hit me like the vast difference between the various generations of radar in the World War II, especially for the fire control, because even when the first PPI sets were deployed, they were usually used for search radar to give like general example or a general overview of situation, but that was not really helping in fire control. And the book listed a lot of instances of how radar fire control relying only on radar could go horribly wrong using the older A-scope radars, which basically everyone and their dog was using at the time if they had a radar at all.
Yep. And for the sake of the viewers, what we're talking about is like early radar is not the classic big circle with a sweep and it pings dots on the radar. That's what comes in with the PPI radar that comes in into 42 into 43, mostly in 43. What we're talking the older radars is essentially you have a almost a static line like you would see on like an audio channel, and you essentially have bearings on that line, and you have to judge based off of how big your signal is, what is there, and so it's rough.
And I would just add, because it's just a quick thing. If you liked Learning War, which is Trent Holmes' book, which is excellent, and I know Drax had done a video with him, so I
did too.
Oh,
Drax could be sort of might be accused of bias, but I'm going to be, as I haven't done a video with him, I'm not going to be. Trent Holmes' books is great, but if you want a good compliment from that and to go on, then I can now be accused of bias because my friend who I did my PhD alongside, he was doing his PhD and Andrew Lambert at the same time as me at King's College, in the Lawson Naval History Department. It is by Benjamin Armstrong and John Freeman, is Developing the Naval Mind. Ooh. And it the history of the US Navy and Marine Corps and how they developed strategy and how they developed officers and what strategies they were looking at and where they came from. And it's really, really good. It's brand new, out November 2021, and it's really worth getting. Both of them, if you have those two books, you will be very, very happy with what you will get from them, because the two together they really, really complement each other and are really worth it.
Yeah, and the other thing which will be a complete nightmare to anyone trying to research radar in World War II, especially naval radar, nobody followed a sane naming convention.
Nope.
The Germans just had families of radar which they had completely separate, unrelated names, but would also have parallel developments of those radars. So you might have a later... SeaTac is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, surface ship-mounted radars that the German Navy deploys. But later versions of SeaTac are more advanced than some earlier versions of radars that are generally seen as their replacements So just because it's got a particular name attached to it, you have to look at what version it's got attached to it. The Americans are just as bad, because what's the difference between an SG radar, an SD radar, a CXAM radar? Eventually they make them a bit saner towards the end, but that doesn't help if you're looking into the majority of it. Yep. And the British are perhaps the worst offenders of all, because they come up with a system that looks sane, because it's got lots of numbers, so you'd think naturally ascending numbers is better radar, but in actual fact it jumps all over the shop, because you can get something like a Type 285 radar and you think, well, that must be better than a Type 275 radar, because a Type 275 is better than a Type 75, but actually the 275 is better than the 285 and replaces the 285, and then you get a 276, which is, we've taken the 277, but we've also taken some of the aspects of the 273 and we've put them together into this one that's now sits in the middle of the designation wise. So, and
also the numbers, not only do they have numbers, they also have letters for those different types of radars and within them, and the reflective remarks, and those letters jump all over the place.
I mean, it was similar with the Americans. Like you have FC Mark 6, FD Mark 8, Mark whatever. Like everyone had a terrible mess. I guess part of it was maybe intentional to confuse, maybe not enemy, but other services that might want the radars. But
I think for the British at least, it's come from the same mind that came up with Royal Navy pennant numbers of the period, which are another complete nightmare. I think what it is they kind of blocked out certain number ranges. And they were like, okay, this number range will refer to, I know, a surface search radar. This will be a gunnery control radar. This will be an air search radar block. And then they very quickly started running out of numbers, and then they started jumping back and forth to try and work out which numbers do we have free, and maybe this number relates to this number in a way, because like I said, Type 275 and Type 285, they're the same kind of radar, albeit the wrong way around. So someone's probably gone, oh yeah, well, we're running out of 280 series numbers, so we have to go back to the 270 series. But if they're both fives, then to me this makes sense, but to no one else does it actually make sense. And it's the same thing with Royal Navy pennant numbers, to be perfectly honest. There's some degree of sanity the lower down you go, but the higher end ones, especially for cruisers, carriers and battleships, make no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, and the German radar story is a little different, because basically what happens is you have radar development in Germany going really fast in the 30s, and then in 1939 Hitler stops the program. And so at that point it kind of branches out into individual companies researching their own radars and then marketing it to the different branches of the military. So you get different companies making the same kind of radar. So you get like one version of surface search and another version of surface search with different brand names, and it all gets confused and messed up because they're doing their own thing and have their own naming conventions for like 3 or 4 different versions.
And like the modern US defense industry, none of the different contractors' components work together.
Yep.
And that's an entirely different job to try and make it work. And none of their parts were able to be swapped between each other, which meant it was a logistical nightmare. It's just and a training nightmare and a maintenance nightmare. And you just sit there and look at it and go, you had something good, and then you made a decision.
I just have a question here, since we reached this topic. Was the electronics manufacturer in Britain as much plagued by the dependence on skilled individual work, like, for example, tank engines were?
Not quite so much. The main problem with British radar development was mass. It wasn't so much mass production in terms of needing skilled workforce. It was availability of materials.
Yeah, you had to outsource a lot of the production to the U.S. and import a lot of the radar. So a lot of the radars were built in the U.S. but were to British standards and sent over, or at least components would be.
Yeah, because you had things like the cavity magnetron
assembled in Canada and then sent over in their packing sections to the UK for fitting.
Yeah. You had things like the cavity magnetron, which allowed the development of centimetric radar ahead of the curve. So British radar technology was advancing fairly quickly, And I mean, that's one of the reasons why you have this complete confusion of number and letter designations, because they're constantly improving on it. It's just that they can make them, they can't make enough of them, especially for the growing wartime fleet. I mean, I think if you still had a fleet that is roughly the size of the 1939 Royal Navy, they probably could have supplied everybody's needs, but the most widely proliferating classes are things like the corvettes and frigates and escort destroyers. There's hundreds of those floating around, and every single one of them, because of the priorities that and the types of missions they're on, needs multiple radars, because it's not just a radar. A ship will need a surface search radar, and even if it's a Flower class corvette, it needs a surface search radar to look for U-boats. It needs an air search radar to look for aircraft. That's the minimum. So you're already producing 2 sets of radar, and if you want a ship, if you move up to maybe a destroyer, then you probably at this point want a gunnery control radar, and you probably want an anti-aircraft gunnery control radar, which are 2 separate things. And then you have to think, okay, maybe with destroyers, so you now opt to maybe 4 radars, maybe more, and the minute you move beyond a destroyer and you actually have the space and the stability to do it, you start thinking in terms of backups, because if somebody like on Onslow puts a shell through Onslow's radar, it's blind, so you want maybe a backup radar. So now even if you're only using those 4 basic radars, you might have actually 8 to 10 individual radar systems. And if you think if you're producing a couple of hundred Flower class, that means you've got to produce 400 to 600 radar sets just for your corvettes.
Yes.
And then the same again for the Hunts, and the same again for Black Swans, and so on and so on and so forth. And that's where the kind of US ability to just take something and produce about 15 billion copies of it, whether it be a radar set, a 20mm cannon, or an Essex class carrier, really comes in handy.
Yeah. I mean, especially on heavy ships, you had at least 2 to 4 secondary battery directors, at least 2 main battery directors, which all needed fire control radars. Then you had a search radar, and you might not like to have a blind spot there, so you have a second one. It adds up. It adds up very quickly.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you have to think, sort of, when you're dealing with a lot of the ships in, especially preparations for D-Day and the Channel War, most of the destroyers and the corvettes and the escort destroyers and the sloops involved in that did get the upgrade with the full destroyer suite of radars. I.e., they did have the gunnery radars. They did have, because it was considered necessary for D-Day and the preparations leading up to that. So you'd have minesweepers, which actually did have anti-air gunnery radar, which did have all those things on, because it was almost, while in fact the advantage of the Americans producing and churning out in such large numbers meant that the British could go, well, hang on, having a ship, even if it's only got a couple of guns, with gunnery radar improves its accuracy that much for its AA work, that frankly for D-Day and for the operations we're doing to clear the channel before D-Day, it's worth it. But this adds even more demand on what you're building.
Yes. Just to quickly run away from the radar topic, because I think we've covered a lot of it. Let's go to pick some of the pre-recorded questions. There is one from Captain Blackwheel. How many of the ships involved were so-called wet deck types, and how did that impact their ability to employ their weapons in the Arctic cold? I guess by wet deck he means like open mounts, and in that case it's basically all of the destroyers, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. You have one twin 15-centimeter turret.
Yeah, on some of the heavier ones, yeah. But I mean, the thing is with destroyers, they're especially the German ones. It's very easy to make a destroyer far too top heavy, and even having a fully enclosed mount can be the difference between too heavy and somewhat acceptably stable. Plus, it adds weight. So when you're talking about what's relatively speaking a lightweight weapon, at least in naval terms, if you have an open-backed mount, it can traverse a lot faster, which is much more useful in a destroyer combat than a marginally better protected one, which is slower and therefore harder to get into action. There was also a certain degree of thought in a lot of navies although not all, when it came to that kind of thing, which was that if you had what was effectively a blast and splinter shield protecting the forward part of the gun, that was fine because the gun would be facing the enemy and hits that were landing around it would, it would protect the crew from the lightweight shrapnel. But it was also thought, if you think about where those guns are, the chances of a hit landing behind them and hitting a part of the ship behind them and then spraying shrapnel, into the now exposed crew is actually relatively low, because they tend to be mounted relatively high in the ship and they should usually be fighting broadside. I mean, in theory, if you're on the forward gun, someone might hit the bridge or something behind you. But the other part of the theory went that in the event that did happen, i.e. it's if someone's sailing firing at your fore or aft end from perpendicular and a shell hits immediately behind you, there was some experience from the First World War, especially with some of the more lightly protected turrets, that showed a heavy shell or a medium shell detonating close to a shield would actually cause more problems, because the shield itself would be partly disintegrated and cause even more shrapnel.
Yep.
So you wanted just enough shielding to protect you from incidental hits that might be occurring in front of you, and because you didn't think there weren't going to be any hits behind you except for the big ones where it wouldn't help anyway, most navies went with open shielded guns until other factors like the need to protect semi-auto loading systems and so forth came into effect towards the end of the war, and that's when you start to see more and more fully enclosed gun mounts. The Americans kind of led the way with the 5-inch 38. We see the twin enclosed gun mounts on things like the Sumners and the Gearings, and the single enclosed gun mounts on the Fletchers. But for most navies, it's only when you start to see the twin mounts or some kind of semi-auto loading where you have to protect mechanical parts from the elements that you start to see fully enclosed, non-armored gun mountings.
We're also talking about fighting in an open mount in the middle of Barents Sea, so your guys have to be wearing gloves, because otherwise you're going to lose fingers very fast.
Yes.
And so you're going to have more fumbling and more just human problems in dealing with this.
Yeah. And
it does have an impact.
Yeah, you've got to remember that the weather is so bad in terms of sea spray and everything, and the cold is so bitter that even though they're fighting, and as we know from like the Mediterranean, when ships get a real good rate of fire going, they can blister the paint off their barrels, and everyone is firing as fast as they possibly can at this battle as well. But even with all that heat being generated, there are issues all across both sides of shells sticking in the racks that their mount being dropped into, and gun barrels icing up between shots. It could literally be a case of, you've just fired a 4 or 4.7 inch gun. The barrel is obviously going to be too hot to touch. Your ship goes bow first through a wave. You get a spray of icy Arctic water, and by the time that spray has cleared and you poked your head round the side of the gun mount, that previously too hot to the touch gun now has icicles hanging off of it, as if it's some part of a sort of slightly aggressive Santa's grotto decoration.
There's one story of one of the gun crew on one of the destroyers, actually one of the gun crews having to go around and whacking it with, they had some piece of metal which they were using, which were a discarded ramrod, and they were using it to whack ice off and make sure the gun was clear because it had got covered.
Mm-hmm.
This is the conditions you're fighting, but also there is another advantage to the shield, and this is something it tends to get less thought about, but it was something the Royal Navy was really thinking about with destroyers. Especially under the treaty limits, you had limitations on your overall weight of your ship, and so you had to watch top weight and all these things because you couldn't make the ship bigger to compensate for bigger guns. But if you can't, it was felt by the Royal Navy it was worse to give an inadequate protection than to give focused area of protection. Because if you consider, if you take this, you can use the same amount of weight of that metal, but you are basically covering almost 3 times the area.
Yeah.
So it's gone from being maybe that thick to being that thick to give you the coverage, and that's no protection at all. So, and you're just in a confined space where when that goes off, you're in trouble. But if you have the thicker shield, then if there's something small enough it can stop it, it gets stopped. And you get the protection. And if it's something which goes through, well, the hope is it will carry on going and go over the other side of the destroyer. But also, there's the fact that if something does land in, the crew can get out. The gun crew can dive for cover. It might not save them, but it gives them a chance. Far more than if they're in an enclosed space which has one way in and one way out.
Returning to the wetness, there is a additional question in the chat from Fog Battleship Scharnhorst. Were the hippers or spes notoriously wet forward?
Not as much as some designs. I mean, the Scharnhorsts were known for being quite wet forward. If you see some of the rarer photos where they have a straight bow, they were absolutely horrific at that point. They got refitted with an Atlantic bow, which, apart from anything, also aesthetically makes them look far, far better. Which it helped, but it didn't completely take away those issues. The Hippers and the Deutschlands were not as bad as the Scharnhorsts, or indeed some of the German destroyers. So it wasn't a kind of a weakness of those designs. But to be perfectly honest, if you're fighting in the Arctic, you're taking that
you
weather,
are going
you're
to
taking
get
water
wet
over the bow, no
anyway.
matter how good you are. Yeah.
I'm kind of surprised about the Deutschlands, because I always thought that they would have these problems with the relatively flat.
They probably would have
but-
if they ever got up to the same kind of speed as the Hippers. But they're generally just a little bit slower, and I mean, to be fair, also their whole form is very different when you look at it from the profile from above.
Right. And like we're also talking about, we have a few of the 1934 destroyers here, which are quite famous for not being stable. Like these destroyers are not what Germany would want to bring, but it's what they had. And so, like, when they were building and when they were first getting these destroyers online, they knew quite quickly that they wanted them to be reserve ships. But after Narvik, you lose 40% of your destroyer first, so you're not exactly spoiled for choice anymore.
Yeah, and even for building new ones, you don't have really time to design like the best of designs. You just have to quickly stamp out basically copies, slightly improved copies of the previous designs, because that's what you already know how to build and you know that they will work. I mean, it's the same as the British wartime emergency classes, which were basically, okay, let's take this existing hull. We don't have those guns right now, so let's put those guns on it and call it a class.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it worked, to be fair, but again, the thing is, you do actually get slightly more. This is going to sound strange, but because the British production is far greater, and this is the other thing for the Germans, their production is quite so small that's something that's often sort of forgotten about. In terms of ships, their production of surface ships, destroyers, anything, is very small relative to their need. The Elbings certainly benefit from far more production than their regular fleet destroyers. The Royal Navy's destroyers, they are stamping them out, but they're building far more. And yes, they vary and they improve them. And so they have far more chances to improve them. So whilst the improvements are very small, each class, it's iterative, they are improving and getting better. Whereas the Germans aren't building enough to really have an iterative improvement process going on. They are building as many as they can, just as they sort of can get under the system they're doing. And this is one of the reasons why, one of the interesting things that happens after this battle and after Raiders fall is, of course, Donetsk comes to gets in charge of the navy, and he changes from having production under the control of Goering's Department of the 5-year plan to Speer's war ministry, in charge of construction, and that actually boosts construction. They actually start getting more submarines. Start getting more things because under the 5-year plan, Goering had basically been ignoring the Navy. It'd been lustrous because he had the Navy, but he'd been pretty much ignoring their production needs. Speer was slightly more generous and was actually a key one in helping Donitz persuade Hitler that actually getting rid of the large surface ships wasn't the most sensible thing to do.
I mean, the other thing you've got to bear in mind is where everyone's destroyer designs were in the run-up to World War II, which actually has a very big impact on the kind of ships they're able to produce during the war when everyone needs to crank out destroyers. Because the British have been, actually, Achates is a very good example. They've started out in kind of the 1,1300 ton range and gradually crept up. Then they've gone into the kind of the 1,800, 2,000 ton plus range with some of the sort of the JKLMNs and the tribals. But because they've got that graduated destroyer design lineage, it means when it comes to the wartime emergency program, they can drop back from the big, expensive, take a long time to produce destroyers with 6 or 8 guns, and they can drop back to this basic 4-gun design that's quite quick to make. And the Americans actually, even though the Fletchers are quite large in overall terms, because they've produced some even larger 8-gun designs, just flotilla leaders and so forth, and actually the Fletchers are quite a good refined design, they are able to mass produce those. The problem that the Germans have, and to a certain extent the Japanese as well, is that they've actually spent quite a long time building big fleet destroyers, which are big, expensive, take a long time to build, even if you're under wartime conditions. And the Germans kind of have an out on that, because while they're still trying to build big fleet destroyers, and part, as you said, to replenish Narvik losses, they do have this almost parallel line of development in their torpedo boats, which everybody else would look at and think of as small destroyers. And by the time you get to the end of that run, they are actually pretty much around the same displacement as the average interwar destroyer anyway.
Yeah.
But although those would be much faster to produce, the problem they've got is certainly by sort of late 42, the designs that they've got available and could have conceivably produced in reasonably large numbers are just a little bit shy of a decent sized destroyer design. They're on the cusp, but they're still very large torpedo boats, which is fine for coastal operations around France and in the Channel and that kind of thing. But you don't want to take a 900 or 1,100 ton ship out into the Arctic in the middle of winter, which comes back to Princeblip's point. It's like they have to take the big ships, the big destroyers, which are they're necessarily quite rare and difficult to get hold of, because that's the only quote unquote small craft that they can feasibly deploy and actually chance to come back again.
Yeah, because
they don't have a kind of an intervening 1,400 to 1,600 ton design that they can churn out.
And it's one of those the sort of the cumulative effects of war, in that the victory at Narvik, the third battle of Narvik, and that I always call it the third battle of Narvik because of course the first is the Norwegians versus the Germans. That has had an ongoing impact on the German Navy, and it's kind of Sherbrooke in this battle is reaping the rewards and the benefits in a way from his involvement in the earlier battle when he'd been in charge of Cossack, when of course famously he smashed into Narvik harbour over a ship which had been sunk sort of blocking the harbour, to make sure he could destroy the German destroyer which was in the harbour. So he basically, they thought he'd go through the gap, and instead he went over the sunken ship and started blasting. It made sense at the time, but again, this is a descendant of Earl St. Vincent. There is a bit of a pirate in him, let's be honest. something. Most normal commanders do not look at a sunken ship and think, you know what, I will charge my ship straight over that.
I mean, there's also that Altmark incident, right?
That was under Vian when he borrowed. Vian borrowed Cossack from Sherbrooke because he decided Sherbrooke was getting a bit tired and needed a rest.
There is a question from Juno 191 official. Weren't torpedoes more dangerous to fire in Arctic conditions?
They could be.
Ask
it depends if you're on,
that.
yeah, I mean, it depends if you're on the receiving end or the firing end, and the answer could be both in both cases. I mean, if you're on the receiving end, I mean, a hole being blown in your ship is bad in any case. But although it's not so much an issue in World War II, but it potentially could be, especially for merchant ships. In the very, very cold waters of the Arctic, there could be issues with torpedo impact causing more of a shattering effect than a ripping effect. Because if you're unlucky, some of your hull material might have undergone transition to a very brittle phase. That is more of a problem with late 19th century ironclads and some World War I era ships. The metallurgy had improved, but quick-built ships and merchant ships that aren't held to the same kind of military standards, or, to be honest, even military ships, when faced with extreme conditions, they could be a bit more risk. The launching ships, on the other hand, as you mentioned, Trinidad, as a torpedo comes back at you, not necessarily a good thing. But the other thing as well is that it would also depend on how you're launching your torpedoes, because your torpedoes some of them were kicked out by pneumatic rams, some of them were kicked out by small gunpowder charges, some of them were kicked out by compressed air. Some of those methods don't really care how cold it is, unless you're extremely unlucky and you've got ice holding the torpedo into the launcher. But other methods were, especially pressure-based methods, were sensitive to it. If it's very, very cold, the pressure will drop and you might not get a successful launch. At which point you could have an active running torpedo stuck halfway in your tubes, at which point you better start hoping it falls out at some point before it winds down to its self-destruct point.
Mm-hmm. And you also, if I remember right, in colder weathers you lose range. So because basically the engines aren't going to burn as efficiently, and so you're going to run into that issue.
Yeah, and again, it depends on what your torpedo is being driven by, and how deep it's running. If your torpedo's burning with, something like a long lance probably isn't going to be too affected, because pure oxygen burn is going to be very high temperature anyway. But if you've got something that's relying on just compressed air, then the shock of being chucked into freezing condition Arctic waters is going to probably, if the torpedo's in the water long enough, that's going to lower the overall pressure within the compressed air flask. So there's going to be less pressure feeding the engine. So the engine's not going to perform as well. The torpedo's not going to go as far. And also probably run much more inefficiently. So you're going to have a lot more of a bubble trail.
Mm-hmm. Now back to the pre-recorded questions from Tematus82.
Mm-hmm.
I shall read it in full. Okay. I shall read it later because, he probably knew what's coming.
This one is directed to Dr. Clarke specifically.
Yes. Okay. N5 Bar is asking, given the convoy was in route during the middle of the Arctic winter with daylight, why did the Admiralty not take advantage of the darkness to place the distant escort closer to the convoy? Was the concern around the U-boat threat?
So generally, the point of distant cover was not to be too close to the convoy. I mean, the clue is kind of in the name. Also distant cover units. Part of their sort of paradigm was that because they could be attached to a convoy, but they weren't part of it. So they could be used to escort multiple convoys. So in this case, Sheffield and Jamaica had actually been part of the escort group for a previous convoy, and were still in the area. So they were also tasked to patrol the area generally to look after this convoy, and if they hadn't seen action, possibly another convoy that came in after them. And it also gave them much more freedom to maneuver, because the destroyers that are part of the actual convoy escort, they have to stick close to the merchant ships, so that means they don't have the freedom to completely chase off an attacker in case somebody goes around and attacks from behind or whatever. Whereas the distant cover forces, by being further away, it gives them the opportunity for pincer attacks, it gives them the opportunity to prosecute an attack to its full extent, and it just gives them much more operational freedom.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, because the distant cover units are much heavier units, you're kind of taking a bit of a chance in some ways, but you are in a situation where it's better to be further away, because then if you can make a successful interception of enemy heavy units, you can have that fight away from the convoy. And there's no risk to the convoy. The convoy has plenty of time to scatter in case the fight goes badly. If they're too close, then even if you're actually straight up fighting the enemy might still get hits in on the merchant convoy anyway. The risk you run is, of course, the further away you are from the convoy, the greater the chance that the enemy might come in from another vector, and then it's going to take you time to get there to help.
Yeah, just to demonstrate. Yeah, I have put up the map. Finally managed to load it. So basically, there was a convoy JW51A that was going, I think, about 10 days before the 51B. Then there was the 51B. The battle happened on the 31st December. But on the 30th December, the return convoy, the RA51, was already leaving from Murmansk. So basically, the distant cover and the heavy cover were in the area basically to, hand over this convoy and take back the returning convoy and get the ships back to the Allied ports, because there was actually a lot of ships that kind of accumulated in Soviet ports over the summer, because there were ships that cannot return, the returning QP series convoys. There were the ships still from the PQ-17, PQ-18. There were also some of the ships from the separate sailing operation. What was the name for that thing?
It's got on my head now as well.
Yeah. But so basically, this was like the crucial thing. The heavy ships were there for more than one convoy. So
Yeah.
And
the flag class corvettes in this operation were HMS Rhododendron and HMS Hybridad, because I just had a Fox take out a Rhododendron in a. Apologies to everyone. I thought I have a couple more minutes. I'll go check, because Rhododendron in a pot got knocked over by a fox, and was worried the fox had got hurt. So I thought, Drac will probably be talking for another seconds. I'll check and send a text message from my mum and go, it's okay. And it was okay. The fox isn't hurt. The Rhododendron's there. But that's why I disappeared. I do apologize.
No problem. But we have now that you are back, we have a question right for you. And I shall quote in full from Tomatus82. To dear Dr. Clarke, what was the biggest lesson learned from the convoy PQ-17 disaster for the Royal Navy?
Distant cover. It was the importance of having it there, and it's one of the reasons why look at PQ-17, why it gets treated the way it does. It's because it was felt that they didn't have enough distant cover, they didn't have enough capabilities in the area, and they did think there was a major surface sortie, and they didn't think they could deal with it. There's also, to an extent, a lesson for the destroyer crews, in that, yes, to be fair, you could probably have understood, and Sherbrook could have potentially justified going out and forming up on distant cover when he saw Hipper and Lutzel Hipper hoving into view, because that would have been sensible. That would have formed a mighty task force. But instead, he goes and engages them himself. And the Royal Navy does sort of go for its destroyer commanders and go, okay, which ones of you are more aggressively inclined, and which ones of you have gone from the other branches of the destroyer force? And it's interesting to note that Sherbrooke's flotilla, which has been used, the 17th, which is part of this operation, is part of many other operations in this, and of course later on in the Battle of North Cape is there as well. Suddenly starts to have regularly tribal class destroyer captains, officers who come from the tribal class, take over command. And it's almost the Royal Navy going, right then, well, we know those destroyer officers because they've gone through those ships. They are selected for those ships with aggressiveness in mind because their job is to protect the other destroyers. Because the tribal class destroyers' job was to pretty much be in front of the other destroyers as they were going in for a mass torpedo attack, providing the firepower and keeping the enemy busy so that the other destroyers could launch a... Basically, they were... You could either call them the wolf in sheep's clothing to protect the flock, or the sacrificial lamb, depending on your perspective. But that was their sort of role. And for that, the Royal Navy had selected a certain type of officer. They had been very keen on selecting that type of officer. And then so they sort of know who already fits that sort of bill. And they start finding those officers and officers like those to run the Arctic convoys. Ones who are more likely to... If they are ordered by a cruiser captain to form up on them, to more likely to go, well, you're a cruiser, you can look after yourself, I've got a convoy to protect and I'll do what I need to do, sort of thing. There's also a conversation with the cruiser captains exactly how they should work. PQ-17 has a big impact through the Royal Navy. But it's also... It's one of the things I always have to point out is there is a logic behind the decisions made. And it's the information available. And it's the trouble with making decisions based on the intelligence. You have the information you have available to you, which is based on your own assessments at that point. And there is the information we have available in hindsight. And what we understand now if we look back. And also, you can sometimes stitch together the same information available far better in hindsight. Because you know when it came in and when it was available and all these things. You don't know necessarily when the person in charge who had to make the decision was seeing that information and had to make that decision. And poor Pound, well, he had to make a decision. And it was his call.
And
it was the wrong call, but that's in hindsight, we know that. If Tirpitz really had been out hunting, etc., we might well be judging him differently.
Yeah. And also, often we know, for example, when information was received by someone, but we don't know when, like how long did it take to get to the actual decision maker on the spot, because quite often the information would be received by a separate ship, then it needs to be relayed, especially if you are in a communications blackout, it needs to be relayed by other means than radio, and that's always a problematic thing. We have a question here from World of Warships.
Or two is that the Royal Navy was often actually better at communicating by lamp light than it was at radio. They would have whole conversations by lamplight.
We have a question from World of Warships Legends channel. Were the British using thermal or electric torpedoes?
Well, if by thermal they mean propelled by internal combustion, then thermal. They weren't battery powered. But there is actually a question in the pre-recorded that I'd like to pick up, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So that's from Mr. Bigglesworth, and he asks because he says his father was an engine room officer on the armed merchantman Esperance Bay, and his question is more of a reminder that the waters are so cold with ice in the water. He says he doesn't know how any sailor could survive an abandoned ship. Do you have any data on that? So yes, when it comes to the Arctic convoys and just fighting in that region period, the unfortunate fact of the matter is unless you are incredibly well wrapped up, incredibly lucky, and in brilliant physical condition, the average survival time if you get chucked into the water in that kind of weather and time period is about 4 to 6 minutes before you'll be dead of hypothermia. And that's assuming you actually even survive jumping in, which a lot of people won't because of the thermal shock. Makes you actually, if you I mean, it's fairly well known. If you dive into cold water, the thermal shock will make you gasp while you're still under the water. Then you get a lung full of freezing water, and you'll probably be dead before you hit the surface, which is a bit grim. But people have been known to survive a little bit longer in the water. If they were already wearing 6 layers plus oil skins plus a great coat, etc., and they were in sort of pretty good health and recently had a meal, so they had energy reserves. Some people survived 8, 10, 12 minutes in the Arctic waters, but that was a remarkable feat. But yeah, usually falling into Arctic waters was a death sentence, unless either you had friends nearby who could haul you out almost as fast as you'd fallen in, or you could do something to lessen the impact of being in the freezing water. So obviously, if you could get into a ship's boat, if you could get onto wreckage, if you could do something to avoid A, being immersed, and B, staying immersed, even if that's only partially basically getting your core out of the water, you're still not that long for this world, but your time might run feasibly into a period where someone might actually find you. And I mean, you see this partly in the Battle of Barents Sea. There's a reason that pretty much every ship that actually goes down unaccompanied goes down with all hands. Akatis has some survivors, but that's because a ship comes along and takes survivors off while she's on her way down. The other ships sink without someone alongside, and everyone goes down with them. And it's the same thing a year later at North Cape. The number of men who are alive when Scharnhorst goes into the water as compared to the number who are picked up is dramatically different, because not a lot of them lasted more than a few minutes. So it is a reminder, I think, to everybody of just how dangerous the conditions were, and also perhaps helps to inform why kind of the minute the guns fall silent, everybody starts rescuing survivors. It doesn't really matter whose side they were on before. If it's a German ship that sunk a British ship, or a British ship that sunk a German ship, it doesn't really matter. In those kind of conditions, it's okay, the fighting's over, we're immediately rescuing people.
Yes, and obviously in the polar night it was made even worse by the fact that it was dark. So
yes,
like
It was
Well-
dark, snow squalls, all
Yes.
sorts of things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
spotting a wet person in the dark is in a dark ocean. It's just
Yeah, that's
Can't
also
imagine.
why there are some like fairly successful rescue stories from the actual ordeal of PQ-17, because that was on the opposite. It was in the middle of the Arctic summer, and the seas were fairly calm, so the rescue ships can actually spot the people in the water and often be there in time. But still, there were like, even in polar summer, it's not a pleasant thing to have to go
No.
to have to abandon ship. And it was even made worse because usually the convoy ships would be prohibited from actually stopping and helping, because that increases the risk for the ship itself. So there were designated rescue ships that were to pick up the crew of sinking ships, but there were only a few of them. So
The rescue ships have an interesting story, because they were, of course, all based on their trial speed, or their fastest recorded speed. They were selected, so they were supposed to be the fastest merchant ships available. But some of them that speed had been achieved with a full load of Welsh coal and various other things, which makes a difference when you compare it to the actual fuel they had in them when they were making the transit, which was not a full load of Welsh coal and a crack crew who were all experienced and really knew what they were doing. And the difference could be 3 or 4 knots. So it could be quite dramatic. And the reality for many rescue ships was that if they go off to rescue someone, they would never rejoin the convoy. They'd be on their own for the rest of the trip across.
yes, I remember reading several accounts from one of the rescue ships from PQ-17. One of the accounts included basically picking up what they thought was a dead body from a lifeboat that they were taking people from, only to find that the sailor was still barely alive. So they managed to revive him, and after that, he just went and got down to the boiler room and basically stayed there for the entire rest of the journey, no matter what was happening above, because basically he just wanted to stay warm for the rest of his life, because that's just like, that must have been quite a traumatic experience. So
Yeah.
that was a very, very good point about the issues of actually even surviving in that area. I mean, there were ships that disappeared with all hands without a trace, simply because of the ice buildup on their upper works. So, like, North Atlantic and Arctic Ocean are not hospitable places.
No.
And I have a question as well, which I'd like to get to, which is Princeblitz's one, which is a lot of economic and strategic effort was spent on both sides, threatening and protecting convoys respectively. Was the cost in the end bigger for the attackers or the defenders? Was the threat of convoys worth the German investment in hunting convoys? Even if they didn't catch all of them, the Allies spent a great deal to protect them and hunting the Kriegsmarine. Could it be considered a strategic success for either side? Well, you have to consider what are the strategic reasons for them. The Allies, their purpose is to get the convoys through. So for them, it's a success as long as they get the vast majority of the convoys through, which they do. For the Germans, it's try to make those convoys as costly as possible. Now, sometimes their intelligence and various other spoofings actually work better than their military operations, i.e. Tirpitz and PQ-17. But the reality is, for the Germans, the Navy and the naval services involved in it were never going. The air services involved in it never were going to get the same level of effort as others did. Even the submarine war, which we always think is such an amazing effort, and so many submarines are produced by the Germans, really, especially while it's under the 5-year plan, Department of the 5-year plan, is really not given the succor and the support it needs versus what has to go into the Wehrmacht, what has to go into providing tanks and all these things, because they're fighting a massive land war.
Yes.
So the question is, if you don't have those submarines, if you don't have those surface ships, and if you're not doing that, how much more material does that support for the armed forces and ashore? Is it decisive? Well, the odds are it probably isn't, because that means you're conceding the sea completely, which means you take all the onus off Britain, you take the onus off all of them. You don't get Norway without a navy. You don't get all the success, any of some of the early successes the Germans get without the navy and without the naval service. You also make the whole Battle Atlantic far easier. If the Royal Navy could spend the Battle Atlantic and all it had to do with each convoy going across was have a C-class cruiser, World War I era C-class cruiser with them just in case something happened, but because the Germans have no navy, don't expect anything to happen, they would have been ecstatic. For starters, instead of building flag-class corvettes, they'd have been building Lion-class battleships and all the aircraft carriers they could dream and all the heavy cruisers. They'd have had a massive fleet sitting in the Mediterranean to wipe out the Ranger Marina and another one go off to the Indian Ocean to stare at the Japanese. It would have been brilliant. So, honestly, having a navy they do for the Germans ties down a lot of Allied resources. It ties down a lot of the Allied effort, because the fact is you have to protect every convoy as if the Germans are coming out with their full force. You have to think about that. But the Germans rarely ever come out with their full force. But the thing is, you always are running convoys. You always have to do the level of protection, which means you require 3 or 4 times that level of force to maintain that. So it's always going. Strategically, it is a win for the Allies, but it's a battle that even contesting gives the Germans a lot of extra options and takes a lot more force from the Allies to win it.
We have a question from the Legends channel again. That ties back to the water conditions. The question is, was the water conditions similar as the sinking of the Titanic? And additionally, how often did the ice removal efforts result in casualties among the crews?
So Titanic.
Water conditions were a lot worse than than you would have had at the time of the sinking of the Titanic. As far as what was the second part?
Were casualties caused by ice removal efforts?
Occasionally, yes. It wasn't common, but it did happen for a number of reasons. There sometimes people would be swept overboard whilst they were clearing the ice. Sometimes people would slip and fall while they were clearing the ice, and either they'd hit their head or something really badly, or slip and fall over the ship, over the side of the ship, man overboard scenario. There were cases of exposure, which may or may not be fatal if they stayed out too long, or they weren't wearing the right protective gear, or they were wearing the right protective gear but were wearing it wrongly. And very occasionally you could also have ice fall. So they could be trying to break away a section of ice, and perhaps they're a little bit too successful and they bring down a bit too much ice from a bit too high up on the ship. And obviously ice does tend to weigh a lot. So yeah, there were casualties. They were not common. So if you went on an Arctic convoy, your captain wouldn't be expecting to lose a few people to the ice. But if a convoy came back, say as a whole unit sailed out and came back and reported maybe 1 or 2 ice-related casualties, people wouldn't be entirely surprised. Although, with that said, very occasionally ice could actually save lives as well. And I say that because I'm reminded of one particular account that I actually do remember being told many years ago, but that was then repeated to me by a member of staff on HMS Belfast, which was an account from a crewman who served on HMS Belfast when it was on Arctic convoy duty. And he used to tell everybody when he kind of worked there, which is where I remember it from as well. Which was he was actually going forward from the ship's superstructure to A turret, the forwardmost turret, during an Arctic convoy, and he had been a little bit silly. He'd put on his hat and his greatcoat and everything, but he hadn't put on his gloves. And stepped out, walked up the port side of the bow, got to A turret, reached out, grabbed onto the rail that was next to the hatch to get into A turret, just at the point that Belfast took a massive wave over the bow, which ordinarily should have swept him off to his death pretty much instantaneously. But because he made the mistake of grabbing frozen metal without a glove on, his hand had stuck to the handrail with a force that was far in excess of what he could have humanly done just holding on. So he was basically stuck to Belfast physically as this wave washed over him, which meant he wasn't washed over the side. And then a very bedraggled survivor was then hammering on A turret, asking them A to let him in, and B, could someone pour a cup of tea over his hand so they could get him fully inside and dry him off and warm him up. So, the ice is dangerous, but very occasionally it can be beneficial.
Yeah. Actually,
the ice on the 6-inch cruisers was especially kind of interesting because they had a specific problem, and talking about the sheets of ice falling down reminded us of ice would tend to build up for some reason, usually on the port side of the bridge superstructure. It wasn't as much on the starboard side. They never understood why, but if you read some of the accounts and some discussions, it used to build up on the port side, and that getting that down would cause sheets of ice to drop down the superstructure.
Yeah, and with the 6-inch cruisers, there was a lot of the. I'll just quickly drop in the images again. Like the superstructure was really tall, especially around the bridge. So comparatively, that was a lot of ice there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we got another question. It's not really very related, but it's an interesting question that I've also asked a lot of times. Did the German designs with 2 turrets on the rear, like on Nuremberg Nuremberg class and Königsberg, come from the Germans thinking they would be outnumbered or running away, or was it just a design compromise?
It's mostly a design compromise because they are very small ships. You see with a lot of cruisers built in the interwar period, these kinds of design compromises coming up in one way, shape, or form. I mean, it's one of the reasons why, for example, the Pensacola's have the rather odd twin turrets forward, then triples over, because of mostly because of hull width considerations, partly also weight distribution. And when it comes to the Königsbergs and the Leipzigs, when you look at a top-down profile of them, you see they are incredibly thin ships. They do not have a lot of beam at all. And when you're positioning how a ship is supposed to work, you have to have the biggest, heaviest part of the ship, which is the machinery, the boilers, the fuel, and the engines. That has to be amidships. So if you've chosen your hull layout, you put your machinery in place, then you have to work out, okay, how much space have we actually got aft and forward of that? And in the Königsberg's case, because of the hull form they'd chosen, because it was small and because it was thin, once you've got the machinery in place and you've obviously the funnel, the trunking, and you've got the superstructure in place, there's not a lot of bow left to put triple 5.9-inch turrets before there's not enough volume to safely install them, at which point you have to, if you're going to have 9 guns, you have to have it aft. You could, in theory, shift all the machinery aft and have 2 turrets forward, 1 aft, but that would require complete reworking of the whole design, which would change the amount of power that you needed, which would change the amount of machinery that you needed, so you'd basically be redesigning the ship. Once you've paired up a machinery and hull combination, aiming for a certain speed at a certain displacement, that does have a huge impact on every other design decision you make.
Yeah.
There was. I mean, yes, to a certain degree, you could say there is some anticipation of the fact that they might be running away from superior forces more often, so it might be better to have more aft-firing guns. But that's kind of offset by the fact that you have those guns, instead of having them in the sort of directly following, you have them in those offset positions, which is in part specifically to allow them greater forward arcs of fire. So that they're simultaneously looking at being able to get as much forward firepower as possible, which kind of gives lie to them just doing it purely because they thought they'd be shooting backwards more.
Well, there's, if I remember right, there's another reason the Königsbergs are set up that way, and that's because they had to run the engine shafts for the middle shaft centerline, and they didn't have the room to fit a turret above the shaft, so they had to offset it in order to give it that extra bit of room.
Yeah, as with many ships, there's a lot of different things that go into the decisions. There's lots of different compromises.
I will
There's
just
also the fact that both those types of cruisers are mine lane cruisers. So both of them were designed to carry 120 mines and deploy them, and that does. It's not so much effective of presuming you're going to be running away or something like that. It's presuming that you might be doing something. You might be out on a distributed on your own operation and find yourself engaged by heavy forces. So you might be doing a long-range mine-laying operation or a mine-laying operation in the Baltic, and that's especially what you have to think about them in terms of Baltic operations more than in terms of North Atlantic and North Cape sort of area. There's a reason why the German light cruisers aren't deployed on this sort of operation, when you'd think actually if you did have light cruisers as available that were more North Sea capable, you'd have thought they'd have been the perfect things to back up Hipper and Lutzow for this operation. Because if you'd had them along with your destroyers, then you'd have had a task force which would each have had a heavy cruiser, a light cruiser, could each had a heavy cruiser, a light cruiser, and 3 destroyers, and that would have definitely won.
That would have been a very
there'd be no chance.
Force. Yeah. On the other hand, if there were the light cruisers up north, then probably the distant cover would also be stronger, right? So it's always a game of chess. So it's
if there had been light cruisers up there as well as heavy cruisers, then the Royal Navy would have probably had either Renown or something like that out operating in that area, something which was fast and had enough firepower to do a lot of damage, but wasn't a major commitment for the Royal Navy if it got accidentally lost.
Yeah,
Although
it's
to be
in-
fair, given the structural issues with the Königsbergs and the Leipzigs, I wouldn't. They're more likely to be lost to the weather than enemy action if you put them out in the Arctic winter.
yeah.
Yeah, but
That was the problem, and that's why they're down back in the Baltic.
yeah, but just to put the this design into context, here's the Königsberg, but here's the Fubuki class, and you can see that it was basically the same deal, because like putting one more turret up front would probably be preferred by the Japanese Navy,
Well,
and it was done on the Shiratsuyus with the single gun turret,
the
but that was
Hatsuharus.
or on Hatsuharu, sorry, yeah,
Yeah.
but that was just too top heavy on
Yeah.
already top heavy design, so.
Yeah, they
That's-
tried it and immediately regretted it and
Yes.
undid it.
So that's the thing. And yeah, I mean for the distant cover, I just realized one thing that probably wasn't stressed enough because it's like often thought as like okay, so the heavy ship finds the convoy and immediately destroys it, but any such engagement would take hours, or well, definitely hours at least. So the distant cover would have time to close in, because obviously if the heavy raider is busy, as we saw here, fighting the escorts off and then getting among the convoy and then chasing one merchant ship after another, that takes time, and the merchants would not make it easy for them. It was basically for example, the case with the, which one was it? The Jervis Bay incident, where the armed merchant started a fight, then armed sloops started a fight, and in the meantime, all the merchants just scarboured all over across all the points of contact. So all the points of compass.
In this particular convoy, there is I forget his name, but the convoy commodore. Each in the group of the merchant vessels, there's always one of the usually a retired Royal Navy officer, or sometimes a very senior merchant marine officer, is appointed as convoy commodore to deal with running the merchant ships. And he apparently, the one on the bridge of the ship, which was his sort of flagship at one point, turned around and said, "Well, if they get through the destroyers, we will try and ram while the rest scatter."
Yes.
And that is what you're dealing with, because that's the sort of thing which they were thinking about doing.
Yeah, and the
It's not
Commodores.
necessarily the most sensible or viable, but it's what they drew. And again, in the nicest way, if you're hipper, yes, I've got all these lovely juicy targets around me, I want to engage them. But if I've got one which is bearing down straight on me and looks like it's trying to ram me, I'm going to concentrate my fire on that one. And while I'm concentrating all my fire on that one, then the others get time to get away, which is going to buy even more time.
Yeah. The Commodores probably also had their pick of the armed merchant guards, the actually Navy or Marine guys who were manning the guns, because again, in PQ-17, the Commodore's ship went down, her crew was picked up by another ship, that went down, and that was the combined crews were picked up by a Soviet oiler, and the armed merchant guards from the Commodore's ship immediately took over one of the AA guns and opened fire like without any rest. So they probably had the like highest motivated crews in the convoy as well, because just
Every ship has a single-use torpedo.
yeah. Well, I mean the
Well, it's like every ship can be a minesweeper once.
yes. I mean, again, in PQ-17, the Troll Armchair was tying depth charges to fuel drums to use them as mines in case torpedoes turned up. So, yeah. I mean, in large part, it was probably just something to keep the crews busy, but...
Never be 100% sure on that scenario,
Yeah.
can you?
we have an interesting question here from Admiral Roberts, which I think is a very common sin. Why do the commentators in the videos get pronunciations wrong? For example, turpits is pronounced as turpits, not tirpits. I guilty as charged. I usually say tirpits. It's because we are not German speakers. I mean, I like to tease my German colleagues with Prince Eugene, but they always suffer. I apologize for that, but I will keep doing it. I am trying to get the pronunciations right wherever possible, but sometimes it's just not happening.
The other thing you've got to remember, to be honest, is that even internally with the languages, there's not necessarily an agreed pronunciation. I mean, I have tried to I have asked a number of people that I know who speak German how to pronounce Gneisenau, and I've had Gneisenau, 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 and Gneisenau, all from people who are legitimately 100% raised in Germany. It just depends on where they're from and what particular dialect of German they speak. So it appears it's just take your pick, whether the G is silent or not, and whether it's ow or at the end, who knows. So, I mean, there probably is a correct pronunciation for that particular German battleship, because it's obviously named after a particular person who would have been from a particular region with a particular received pronunciation of his name. But I think the other thing is it's also familiarity. If you're in the English speaking world, it's always called Tirpitz. Everyone pronounces it Tirpitz, so it's going to be very difficult to break away from that. And if you're not specifically thinking about it, you're always, as an English speaking person, you're pretty much always going to say Tirpitz. And to be fair, even amongst the English speaking world, I don't always either necessarily get the pronunciation right, or I don't necessarily get the pronunciation right according to the person who's listening. Because I've always heard, and from Americans, admittedly mostly East Coast Americans, that there's the American battleship at Pearl Harbor, the USS Nevada, but apparently according to natives of the state, it's Nevada. And I did actually hear somebody from the northwest of the United States call it Nevada. And I'm pretty sure no one actually uses that. I think that was just
let's not talk about the Worcester.
I can confirm the Nevada.
I do have one important question that's come in on the Twitch chat while we were talking about this, which is which is said, could Drac pronounce Schleswig-Holstein?
Oh, Schleswig-Holstein. I hate that thing.
But yeah, the Nevada thing is a thing. Because at least in Missouri, there is Missouri has this thing about naming cities after other states. Don't ask, but there is a city in Missouri called Nevada, and it's pronounced Nevada and not Nevada. But most people in the Midwest would say Nevada. And so you really have to screw it in your head that it's pronounced differently for some reason. It's arbitrary. Wow. But even with an English named ships, we mess up. Like Boise, boys.
What?
Yeah.
Worcester,
Worcester. Yeah, Worcester. Yeah, because this thing a little bit. Actually, it doesn't really matter because I don't live there anymore. But I spent the first 25 years of my life growing up in a town called Worcester Park. So if I see a ship spelt that way, obviously without the park end, I'm gonna say Worcester because that's what I've grown up with. Yeah. But obviously, that's not how the U.S. Navy pronounces it. Apparently. But good luck ever persuading me to change that. And that's before we get into how you pronounce Harwich. Is it Harwich? Harwich?
I remember when we were introducing the American light cruiser line, there was very vivid discussion in the Twitch chat between inhabitants of the United States of America how to pronounce that damn Tier 10. Apparently, for locals, it's Wista.
Yeah. Yeah, there's at least 4 different ways I've heard, because you have Worcester, you have Worcester, like a rooster, but Worcester, and then you have Worcester, and like almost like a UE sound or EU sound, and then and then Worcester.
Oh, like that's the worst.
Like almost like worst, and it's
Well, Juno 191 has just said he slapped friends for mispronouncing Prince Eugen, so perhaps we should be very careful if we get too close to him.
Who?
There seems to be Juno 191. Sorry.
I see.
I have both the chats going in corners of my screen to watch them.
No, I just forgot to scroll down. So
I enjoy seeing the response in chat.
There is a question from Yamato 8125. Actually, two questions. One, due to the fact that this was an important quantity of cargo in this convoy for the Russian front, did it help the Russian front against the Wehrmacht? And two, how decisive the presence of Sheffield and Jamaica in the area, given how decisive the presence of Sheffield and Jamaica in the area was, could the presence of a county-class cruiser or a heavy cruiser to protect the convoy help avoid the loss of the ships that were lost?
Yeah, so I think I can handle the first one.
Yes.
Basically, it's impossible to quantify. Because, depending on the source you read, Russia was saved by Lend-Lease, or Russia did not need Lend-Lease, or anywhere in between. And narrowing it down to this specific convoy supplies did this is basically impossible. But I think generally speaking, most people agree that a lot of Lend-Lease helped and probably was necessary, but wasn't war winning in that sort of sense for Russia.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the Lend-Lease stuff was kind of like a soft power. It was for example, this specific convoy, the JW-51B, carried 200 tanks, but also 2,046 other vehicles, which were probably far more useful, actually, than the tanks, because the Soviet industry, while switching to war, had to limit very much production of trucks, because simply not all factories could be moved and so on, and which were moved had to be redirected to produce tanks and so on. So one of the biggest impacts of the Lend-Lease was actually such mundane things as trucks, jeeps, train engines, even just rails.
Yeah, and tractors.
That's so the 200 tanks probably helped somewhere. By this time, they probably were still mostly M3 Lee, so they probably wouldn't be too appreciated by by their users.
The Russian nickname for the M3 was a coffin for 7 men.
Yeah.
So they didn't have a very high opinion of that one.
Yeah. But the rest of the supplies was pretty useful. And one important thing about the Arctic convoys is that they were getting to the part of the USSR which was a very long way away from the Iron route or from the Far East route. They basically were delivering things directly to the Northern Front, which both helped keep the sea lane open and helped to relieve the pressure on Leningrad. So it was not the biggest part of the Lend-Lease supplies that got to the USSR, but it was getting to a very isolated area which otherwise wouldn't probably get those supplies. So it definitely did have impact. It's hard to quantify how big an impact, but it was there.
Yeah, and when it comes to the county class, sorry, do you want to go for that, Dr. Clarke?
Well, just quickly, because I've been talking. I'm doing the year of the cruiser on my channel for some reason. I just got so many questions about cruisers. I ended up doing all the long patrols for the year. All the recorded videos are about cruisers, and I'm just doing a series on the counties. And the whole point is, if you had a county with you, a full fat county, and I say full fat because I mean not Exeter and York by this point are no more. You would have had a very useful ship, but it would have been with the distant cover. So it would have come in with Sheffield and Jamaica, and they would have come in probably as 3 cruisers, and which is not unusual because, let's be honest, the Battle of North Cape involves 3 cruisers. They would have probably come in, and they might have scored more damage on Hipper. Would a few 8-inch shells do much more damage than the 6 inches achieved? Depends where they hit. Depends how lucky and how accurate they are. It's the same with the Deutschland, aka Lutzow. It would have depended where they hit and how lucky they were. But what is more certain is that if you have a slightly heavier cover force out there, and if the Germans do realise that there's a heavier covering force than they know about, and they do seem to have been under an idea that it was a weaker covering force than it was, they might have not come in the first place. Because one of the advantages for the Germans, by timing as they were, they did lull the British and lull the Allies occasionally into a false sense of security. They felt they haven't set out. This is why you've got 2 large, capable light cruisers, but light cruisers as the heavy covering force. There had been heavy covering forces which involved battleships and distant cover and all sorts of things. Early in the war, later in the war. But there are times when you have a lot of needs going on around the world, and you think, well, they haven't done anything recently, and they've been quite quiet, so maybe we can get away with 2 light cruisers for this bit, while we have the other bits off doing, maybe even refitting with new radars. Because this is one of the problems when it comes to putting in radar and all the new equipment, you have to take the ship out of service to put it in. And it takes time to work up with the new equipment. You don't just fit it and go to battle. It has to go off with its crew for a few weeks, perhaps, with exercise and testing to get itself ready and then go off. So you've got constant demands, and it's balancing those demands. And a county would have been a nice thing to have. It would have possibly caused a little bit more damage, and I'm sure Drac will get into that. But in the end, it wasn't there and it wasn't needed.
Yeah, and in the specific scenario of Barents Sea, a county isn't going to be attached to the convoy itself. It's going to be with Sheffield and Jamaica, or instead of one or the other. So if we take the optimal situation, so you've got a county there as well as the 2 light cruisers, it's not going to save Bramble, because Bramble was caught up, out away from the convoy up north while it was trying to hunt down a merchantman who had gotten lost. So the presence or not of a county isn't going to make any difference to that engagement. And Achates was hit and mortally wounded before the covering force showed up, the distant cover force showed up. So again, even if a county had been with it, it wouldn't have saved Achates. And possibly, given the seakeeping capabilities of a county, if it had gone full pelt, it might have arrived just soon enough to save some of the damage to the O class. But the thing is, pretty much all the British damage and losses had occurred before those 2 cruisers showed up.
Yeah. And to be fair, while the 8-inch shells would deal more damage, the 6-inch guns had a higher chance of scoring some hits, which, given the orders that the German commanders had, meant that they had a far higher chance of scoring the necessary mission kill, as they did, because, I mean, one shell per gun per every 30 seconds, roughly, I would say, for the county, or 20 seconds maybe, compared to the about 8 to 10 shells per minute for the 6-inch guns. That's a huge difference in the volume of fire. That's like, or what was actually the British 6-inch rate of fire? It was around 8-ish, right?
6 to 8 rounds a minute.
6 to 8.
Yeah, there's some ships that could do slightly better, but yeah, once it comes to the actual fight, an 8-inch shell is much more of a danger. But Hipper retired pretty quickly anyway. About the only scenario you could potentially argue would be that in the initial engagement, as we said, there was a 6-inch hit that did start causing some leaks in a boiler room. Potentially an 8-inch shell hitting in roughly the same area might have caused a full-on flood. And if that had then forced the evacuation and shut down of a boiler room, that might have dropped Hipper's speed to a point where they could be hunted down and mobbed because it couldn't escape effectively. But that's not going to save any British ships. It's just going to doom a German one.
Actually, the hour is already quite advanced, I see. It's 9:18. So we are slightly over time, and I guess we will have to slowly wind down. So are there any interesting pre-recorded questions right now? I don't see any more interesting than what we already picked. But there are some questions from the Legends channel. One of them, why were the Scharnhorst class built at first without the Atlantic bow, but the Bismarck... why were the Scharnhorst class built at first without the Atlantic bow, but the Bismarck class was built with it? I guess that was an experience from the Scharnhorst.
Yeah, and you gotta keep in mind, Scharnhorst is like 5,000 tons overweight, essentially, from what they intended. And so, with the proper amount of weight in Scharnhorst, the bow problem would not have been as serious. But even still, you're talking about a design evolution. So they're learning lessons from the Scharnhorsts as they're working on the Bismarcks and modifying over time.
And they're also learning lessons from other ships as well.
Right.
Because they're not just building the capital ships, they're building the cruisers and the destroyers and everything. So the Germans are taking general lessons on seakeeping from everything that they're building, and they're trialing and running in service and applying that to future designs, which is one of the reasons why they're able to come up with an Atlantic bow refit for the Scharnhorst. Because let's face it, there's not that many ships outside of the Scharnhorsts and the Italian refit dreadnoughts that actually have a completely resculpted bow put in and have it work anywhere near as well as the designers were hoping.
Yeah, and I mean, we have the 1934 destroyers coming in, as the Scharnhorsts are starting construction, and they find that essentially the same sort of bow form basically just cuts and digs in rather than rides over waves, and so they're already learning from that, and eventually those ships end up getting sort of Atlantic-like bows, but not the full bird.
I mean, it can be seen even in the development of the Admiral Hipper class, because the Prince Eugen is already built with a significantly better shaped bow than the original Hipper was.
Yeah.
That's.
I mean, Eugen ends up being 10 meters longer than Hipper.
Yeah, it's one of the things I always point out with the Admiral Hipper class. It's stretching things a little bit to even call it a class. It's more a series of closely related subclasses, because there are quite significant differences from Hipper to Blücher to Prince Eugen and what would have been the successors.
I tend to call it the Hipper family rather than the Hipper class.
That's
good.
good.
They're more like siblings than twins.
Juno 191 official. We don't talk about the Hipper class Blücher. We do, but well, we did when we were talking in Norway
for a very short amount of time.
Yeah. Oh dear.
Yeah. So I guess this is it.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Thanks for the interesting chat, and I will ask for that book recommendation in Discord, please, afterwards.
Sent it already.
Nice. Okay.
Nice.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you very much. It sounded really interesting and something that I really would like to acquire and read. Obviously, on my to-do reading list is also the the Tribals Battles and Darings. So, Snapchat is asking to share the book as well in this in the stream chat. I shall.
Let me see if I'll get the because that's learning more. So I'm gonna share it in the Legends channels. So
Yes.
this is Learning War. This is about the U.S. Navy learning how to fight throughout the Guadalcanal campaigns.
Yeah, I did. There's two whole videos I've done with Trent Hone, which
Yes.
look at the development of US Navy tactics, which is very much based on his on learning war as well. So check those out as well if you want the audio form.
And then
They
this
are
is-
great videos.
And then this is developing the naval mind.
Yes.
Which is not letting me send. It's too large for the link is too large for YouTube.
Yes. So I think I'll just paste the name of the book.
Yeah.
That should work better.
So this
They are
Yes.
they are very good books, and Benjamin Armstrong is now a lecturer at the U.S. Naval Academy. He's a former U.S. naval officer, helicopter pilot, very decorated, very skilled. Did his PhD alongside me at King's, and has also written an entire series. If you've ever seen a series, what would the 21st century Mahan, or what would Mahan do in the Pacific, and that sort of thing. wrote all those books, and he's the one who got the 21st century Mahan, 21st century Gorshkov Corvette series going, and actually was the idea and the motive behind it. He is really, really smart, and his books are really, really good.
That also sounds fascinating.
Yep.
Yeah. So, any interesting video plans coming up?
Oh well, as many of you probably know, I'm going to be in the US for pretty much most of April. So there's going to be a bit of a breakneck series of filming going on various US museum ships. Hopefully the weather will hold, and hopefully the winds will be calm, so my poor little drone doesn't get blown out to sea. So there'll be lots of interesting videos coming up from that. And I also have some other quite interesting videos from visits to various museum ships and locations that I've managed to do over the past couple of years, which will be being released over spring and summer this year, because now obviously you can travel to those places. So that's why I've been sitting on a lot of those videos, because obviously I've received a lot of help from places like Chatham Dockyard, the island of Jersey as a whole, the Golden Hind replica up in London, and it felt a little bit cheap of me to take all the wonderful footage I've gathered with their help and publish videos in the middle of a pandemic when no one can go and have a look at those places. But all of those will be being turned into videos and more this year, so look out for those.
Yep.
That's cool. That's cool. I'm always on the lookout for recommendations for new places. So.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to see intact Atlantic wall defences rather than ones that have been shot and shelled and bombed to pieces, Jersey and the Channel Islands are pretty much the only place to go.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds nice.
And I'm doing the Year of the Cruiser, going for all those, but also the one I'm really excited about, and one reason why I keep trying to jump in, because I'm really excited about this, is hopefully I'm either going to get funding or I'm in and then going to pay for myself, because I'm going to go see HMCS Haida and hopefully HMCS Sackville in June. And the wonderful Drac has said he will come with me to stop me trying to nick the ships, or maybe bet me in stealing them. Who knows? This is the last remaining tribal class destroyer in the world. If you leave me alone with her and I find the keys, well, we'll be going for it. I apologize to Canada now in advance. But no,
I guess we will have to warn the Canadian authorities to search your hand luggage when returning to look for any hidden ships.
That's if we're flying back. We might be coming back across the Atlantic by ship. With the RCN chasing after us.
Okay, you have already a volunteer in the chat for a crew.
We will take cruise missions.
Do you have any experience with Admiralty drum boilers?
A little bit, actually. I do have a little bit of experience, courtesy of my father.
Cool. Well, then we'll be watching the news with great interest. Yeah. So, once again, thank you for coming. This has been fun. And for the topic for the next Armchair Admirals that will happen at the end of February will be destroyer leaders, approached from kind of both sides, both the big destroyers and small cruisers, because it's kind of like intermediate category, let's say. So we will go over the various approaches and what worked, what didn't work.
Indeed.
And
good.
With that, see you next time and have fun.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.